Urath Station was the biggest gathering place in the known galaxy. It floated at the edge of neutral space like a small moon made of glass and steel and alien ambition. Every great civilization sent their best people here, their sharpest minds, their strongest voices, their most powerful warships docked in the bays below. The conclave met once every 5 years, and whatever was decided inside its great chambers shaped the fate of hundreds of worlds. This cycle was special. This cycle, Earth had been invited for the very first time. The docking bay of Urath Station was already crowded when the human vessel came in. The Vethkai delegation had arrived hours earlier in 3 warships that looked like blades of frozen lightning, long, silver, and humming with psionic energy fields that made the air around them shimmer. The Lurian merchant convoy had come in sleek white transports that moved with an almost living grace, their hulls smooth as river stones. The Dreth Collective had sent a single vessel so massive it had its own small gravity field and had to dock in the outer ring. And then the human ship came through the gate. It looked like it had been built in someone's backyard on a bad weekend. The hull was dark and patchy, with visible repair welds running along the sides like scars that nobody had bothered to hide. There were burn marks near the rear engines that had clearly never been cleaned. The ship was small, embarrassingly small compared to even the Lurian scouts. And when the landing gear extended, it made a grinding, clanking sound that echoed across the entire bay. Several Vethkai officers turned to look. Then they turned to each other. Then they laughed. It was not a quiet or polite laugh. It was the kind of laugh that starts in the chest and fills a room. Admiral Sirvos of the Vethkai stood near the observation rail above the docking floor. In his tall frame wrapped in ceremonial silver armor, his iridescent skin catching the light in colors that shifted between blue and gold as he moved. He watched the human ship settle into its bay and shook his long, elegant head slowly. "Is that their warship?" he asked one of his officers. The officer checked his scanner. "It appears to be their diplomatic transport, Admiral." Sirvos looked again at the patchy, scarred little vessel sitting in the bay. "Why, then the gods of the universe have a sense of humor," he said. More laughter. Then the ship's door opened and Prince Caden Voss of Earth walked out. He was not tall by alien standards. He was not built like a soldier, though he carried himself like one, steady and unhurried. He wore armor that had no shine to it at all, just flat dead black with thick bolts at the knee and shoulder joints and polymer welds across the chest that were neat but very clearly visible. His boots were scratched. His right glove had a small tear near the knuckle. At his side hung a sidearm that looked older than the station itself, a blocky, heavy weapon with a grip worn smooth from years of handling. In his left hand, he carried a data pad. The screen was cracked, a single diagonal line running from the top left corner down toward the center. He stepped out of the ship, looked around the docking bay with calm brown eyes, and then smiled, quietly and without any particular concern for anyone who was watching him. Word spread fast on Urath Station. By the time Caden Voss and his small team of 4 had made it through customs, half the station already knew about the human ship and the human armor and the cracked data pad. Delegates leaned over their tables in the open lounge areas and whispered. The Lurian merchants, who had built an empire on knowing which way the wind was blowing, had already begun revising their estimates of Earth's negotiating power downward. The Dreth Collective said nothing, because the Dreth Collective never said anything out loud, but their shared hive thoughts buzzed with something between amusement and disinterest. Admiral Sirvos gave Caden a name before dinner on the first night. He called him the Scrap Prince. By morning it had spread to every delegation on the station, and by the second day it had become the unofficial title that nearly every alien diplomat used when talking about the human envoy, sometimes to his face, barely disguised beneath formal language, and sometimes openly, with laughter that was not even bothered to be hidden. Caden Voss heard it every time. He never reacted. That was the part that confused Essel. She was a junior diplomat from the Lurian Consortium, young by her people's standards, serious, and better at reading a room than most of the senior delegates twice her age. She had been watching Caden Voss since he arrived, not out of mockery, but out of habit. She watched everyone. It was how she had survived 3 years in a world where alliances shifted like sand and smiling faces hid knives. What she saw in the human prince did not fit any pattern she knew. When Sirvos made the scrap prince joke at the first formal reception, loud enough for half the room to hear, Caden had been standing near the far wall with a glass of water in his hand. His team did not drink the station's offered refreshments, she noticed. They had brought their own. And he had turned, looked at Sirvos, and simply nodded once as if he had received a piece of mildly interesting information. Not embarrassed, not angry, not performing patience for the room, just calm. Not the kind of calm that did not come from not caring. She had seen not caring before. This was different. This was the calm of someone who was exactly where they planned to be, doing exactly what they had planned to do, and was not in any hurry because all the time they needed was already accounted for. It sat in the back of her mind like a splinter she could not reach. On the second evening, she passed Caden in the corridor near the station's main observation deck. He was alone, which was unusual for any delegate. Even junior ones always traveled in pairs for safety. He was looking out at the stars with his cracked data pad held loosely at his side and that same quiet expression on his face. She almost said something. But something stopped her. Some instinct, sharp and nameless. She kept walking instead. That night, she pulled up everything the Lurian intelligence files had on Earth. There was not much. A young civilization, a single inhabited world. A small colonial presence on 2 nearby moons. A military that had never fought an interstellar war. Technology rated at Class 3. Basic spaceflight, basic energy weapons, no psionic capability, no hive networking, no crystalline computing. Nothing that explained that expression. Nothing that explained why a man standing in borrowed time, representing a species that the galaxy had already decided was irrelevant, looked like the most settled person on the entire station. And she closed the file. She could not sleep. And somewhere on the other side of the station, in a small and battered ship that every alien diplomat had already stopped paying attention to, Prince Caden Voss sat in the dark with his cracked datapad and listened to everything. The ship was quiet at night. Ireth Station kept its public areas lit at all hours because different species ran on different cycles and commerce did not sleep. But the docking bays went dim after the third shift change, and the human vessel sat in its bay like a shadow among shadows, unlit, unmoving, unremarkable. Inside, Caden Voss sat at the small table bolted to the wall of his cabin. He had taken off the chest plate of his armor and set it on the table in front of him. The flat black surface caught no light at all. He ran his thumb slowly across one of the welds, the thick, obvious, ugly ones that every alien diplomat had laughed at, and felt the layer beneath it. There was a reason the welds were there, not to hold the armor together. The armor did not need help holding together. The base material was a compressed ceramic titanium composite that had been tested against every known directed energy weapon in the Vethkai arsenal and had performed better than anything the Vethkai themselves fielded. The welds were there to cover the sensor-scattering mesh woven into the underlayer, a material that absorbed electromagnetic signals the way dark cloth absorbed light. Every scanner on Ireth Station had swept the human vessel and its crew at least a dozen times in the past 2 days. Every single scan had come back with the same result. Basic life signs, no active energy sources, no weapons above Class 2. Every single scan had been wrong. The bolts at the joints were not structural either. They were manual disconnect points. If someone flooded the station with a high-frequency pulse, the kind the Vethkai used to fry electronic systems before a boarding action, every slick networked suit in the building would lock up solid. Caden's armor would shrug it off, disconnect from nothing because it was connected to nothing, and keep working exactly as designed. He put the chest plate back on. Then he picked up the cracked data pad. And the crack was real. It had happened 3 years ago when he had dropped the pad during a training exercise back on Earth, and he had never replaced the screen because the crack did not affect the function, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was actually useful. People saw a cracked screen and thought cheap, thought careless, thought unimportant. They stopped looking closely after that. The datapad ran a fully isolated operating system with no wireless capability of any kind. No signal out, no signal in. It could not be hacked because there was nothing to connect to. It communicated with his team's equipment through a short-range cable system only, a technology so old that no alien intelligence agency had bothered building tools to intercept it in over a century. While every other delegation on IRETH station used sleek, networked, in state-of-the-art communication systems, systems that talked to each other constantly, that synced with the station's own infrastructure, that broadcast tiny handshake signals into the air every few seconds just to confirm they were still connected. The human team had been completely dark and listening, because all those handshake signals, all those sync pulses, all that beautiful, expensive connected technology was broadcasting fragments of data into the air constantly, and most of it was scrambled, most of it was encrypted. But encryption was just a puzzle, and Caden's team had brought the best puzzle solvers on Earth, and they had been running decryption cycles around the clock since the ship docked. By the morning of the first day, they had broken the Lurian commercial encryption. By the afternoon, they had cracked 2 of the Dreth Collective's internal frequencies. Now, by the end of the second day, they were reading Vethkai strategic communications in near real time. Caden set the datapad down and looked across the table at his team. 4 people, all of them young, all of them looking like the least threatening individuals who had ever attended a galactic summit. There was Marin, who had 3 advanced degrees in xenolinguistics and could parse an alien dialect in under 4 hours. There was Dov, who had the build of someone who sat behind a desk all day and the eyes of someone who had not slept in a week, because he had not slept in a week. He was the one running the decryption cycles. There was Pry, quiet and careful, who handled the passive sensor array that was disguised as the ship's weather monitoring equipment. And there was Sergeant Hollis, who said almost nothing, and whose job Caden had never once had to explain to anyone because Hollis's job was self-evident. "We're Dov," Caden said. Dov looked up from his screen. "We have 73% of the Vethkai diplomatic channel," he said. "And something interesting from the Lurian side, there is a private channel between their head merchant and 3 of the neutral species delegates. It is not diplomatic traffic. It looks like an exchange of financial instruments." Caden nodded slowly. He thought back to a room on Earth, a long, low room in a government building that had no nameplate on the door. And he had sat at a table there 2 months before departure while 6 of the most senior people in Earth's government looked at him across the polished surface. The briefing had been short. "You are not going to IRETH Station to make friends," the council chair had told him. "You are not going to impress anyone with our ships or our weapons or our technology. We have looked at the intelligence reports, and we know what they think of us." And that is fine, because people who underestimate you always tell you more than people who fear you. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Keep your ears open and your mouth shut until the moment we need it open. Then open it. Caden had asked one question. "And if they make a formal move against us before that moment?" The chair had looked at him steadily. "Well, then you remind them what happens when someone reaches into the dark and finds out the dark was not empty." He had carried that sentence with him across the stars. Now he picked up the sidearm from the table, the one every alien who had seen it had dismissed as an antique, and turned it over in his hands. It was old on the outside, yes. The grip was worn, the finish scratched. But he pressed the small recessed button on the left side of the barrel housing, and the weapon unfolded, quietly, smoothly, with a series of soft mechanical clicks, into a configuration that bore no resemblance at all to what it had been a second before. It was not in any alien weapons catalog, because it had been designed in a lab that did not officially exist, by an engineering team whose names were not on any public record, to be effective against the specific armor and shielding signatures of every species currently on this station. Earth had not spent its quiet years being quiet. It had spent its quiet years paying attention. Caden folded the weapon back into its old, battered, harmless-looking shape. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Pry. "How long until we have a full picture of their pre-vote positioning?" Pry checked her screen. 18 hours at current rate, she said. Caden nodded. "Good," he said. "Then we have time." He leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling of his small, battered, embarrassing ship with an expression that no alien at the conclave had seen from him yet, because it was not polite, and it was not calm, and it was not quiet. It was satisfaction, deep, patient, long-awaited satisfaction, the kind that only comes to people who waited for exactly the right moment and then watched it arrive exactly on schedule. The formal session on the third day began the way all formal sessions at the conclave began. The great chamber filled slowly, each delegation taking their assigned seats at the curved table that ran in a wide arc around the central speaker's floor. The room was enormous, built to make every species in it feel both important and small at the same time. The ceiling was a dome of transparent alloy showing the stars outside. The lights were set to a neutral frequency that looked comfortable to every species present, which meant it looked slightly wrong to all of them. And Caden took his seat at the human position, the last chair on the outer arc, the smallest allocated space at the table, and placed his cracked datapad flat in front of him. He folded his hands. He waited. The first 2 hours of the session were routine. Trade agreements between the Lurian Consortium and 2 smaller civilizations were ratified with polite applause. A border dispute between the Dreth Collective and a minor species called the Halveth was tabled for further review. So several technical resolutions about navigation lanes in the outer corridor systems were passed without discussion. Caden said nothing during any of this. He did not need to. None of it affected Earth. And more importantly, he was watching. The way Sirvos leaned slightly toward the Lurian head delegate during the trade vote. The way 3 of the neutral species representatives exchanged a look just before the Halveth dispute was tabled. That the way the Dreth Collective's representative sat just a fraction straighter when the outer corridor resolutions were read aloud. He had been reading these patterns for 3 days. He knew what was coming before Sirvos stood up. Admiral Sirvos rose from the Vethkai position with the smooth confidence of someone who had planned his next move for months and had no doubt whatsoever about how it would land. Yet he was dressed in his full ceremonial uniform today. Silver with gold trim at the collar, the Vethkai crest pressed into the chest plate, his iridescent skin perfectly lit by the chamber's overhead lights. He looked like power made flesh, and he knew it. He placed a data crystal on the speaker's podium. "I bring forward a formal motion," he said, in the common tongue that all conclave delegates were required to use in session, his voice carrying easily across the huge room. "A motion regarding the official status classification of the species known as humanity and their representative delegation currently seated at this table." Every head in the room turned. Several turned toward Caden. Caden did not move. Sirvos tapped the crystal, and a holographic display rose above the center of the chamber. Charts, star maps, data tables, all of it projected in crisp blue light. "As this body is aware," he continued, "the classification of pre-sovereign species carries specific legal implications under the Conclave Charter. A species classified as pre-sovereign is recognized as an emerging civilization not yet capable of independent interstellar governance. Under this classification, their space is open to guided development programs. Their vote in conclave proceedings is suspended pending a review period of no less than 20 years. And their diplomatic access is limited to observer status only. He paused to let that land. It landed hard. Several delegates looked uncomfortable. Others looked carefully at their own table surfaces. Two junior members of the Lurian delegation exchanged a fast glance. Asal, seated 3 positions from the head of the Lurian table, felt something cold settle in her chest. "I submit," Sirvos said, pulling up the first of his charts. That humanity meets every criterion for this classification. Their energy output is consistent with early-stage planetary civilization. Their military capacity is rated below the threshold required for independent system defense under Article 7 of the Charter. Their technological development index places them firmly within the pre-sovereign band. And their colonial presence, 2 small settlements on neighboring moons, does not constitute the interstellar footprint required for full member standing. He brought up a second chart: population data, energy readings, military output numbers, all of it rendered in precise official-looking format. Every number was wrong. And Caden knew every number was wrong because his team had spent 3 nights confirming exactly which fabricated data sets the Vethkai Intelligence Service had prepared for this presentation. It was good work, he had to admit. Convincing, well-sourced in appearance, built from a skeleton of real publicly available Earth data that had then been quietly and carefully adjusted downward at every key metric. It looked real. It was designed to look real. Sirvos concluded his presentation with the calm finality of a door being closed. "I call for a vote on the formal reclassification of humanity as a pre-sovereign species under the Conclave Charter, effective immediately upon passage of this motion." The chamber went into the pre-vote deliberation period. 15 minutes where delegations could consult internally before the final call. Caden watched. He watched Sirvos move smoothly through the room during the deliberation, stopping at 3 tables. The 2 neutral species delegations that Dov had flagged as probable targets for Lurian financial persuasion, and the small, quiet delegation from the Mavari Collective who had been on the fence about Earth's status since the beginning of the session. He watched the brief conversations, the small gestures, the expressions that changed just slightly by the end of each exchange. He watched the Lurian head delegate not move from his seat and not look at Sirvos once, and which told Caden that whatever arrangement existed between them had been settled long before today. The deliberation period ended. The vote was called. The tally moved quickly down the arc of the table. For the motion, 7, against, 5, abstaining, 4. The presiding officer began tallying the final 2 delegations, the Mavari Collective and the Halveth, both of whose votes Sirvos had visited during deliberation. The Mavari voted for the motion. The Halveth abstained. And the presiding officer looked up from the tally. "The current count stands at 8 in favor, 5 against, 5 abstaining. 1 delegation has not yet cast." "Earth," said Sirvos smoothly, and a ripple of something moved through the room. Amusement, anticipation, the particular pleasure of watching the conclusion of a foregone thing. The presiding officer looked at Caden. "The human delegation has the floor before final tally." Caden did not stand up immediately. He sat for exactly 3 seconds, 3 full, unhurried, absolutely deliberate seconds, looking at the flat surface of his cracked data pad. Then he stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry or afraid or even particularly concerned. He looked the way he had looked in the docking bay on day 1, and in the corridor near the observation deck, and at every formal reception where the jokes had been told loud enough for him to hear, calm, settled, and already several moves ahead. "I would like to table a counter-presentation before the final tally is recorded," he said. Sirvos tilted his head with the tolerant expression of someone allowing a child to finish its sentence. "The delegation has 2 minutes, he said, not waiting for the presiding officer to grant it. Caden picked up his cracked datapad. He walked to the center of the chamber floor. He placed the datapad on the speaker's podium, screen up. "I appreciate the 2 minutes," he said. "But I only need 1. He tapped the screen, and the room changed. The holographic display that rose from the cracked datapad was not small. It filled the center of the chamber floor from edge to edge, a massive layered web of data that unfolded like a flower blooming at 10 times normal speed. Charts, audio files, communication logs, star maps, financial records, and a column of timestamps that stretched from the top of the projection all the way down to the floor. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the first line of text resolved into focus, and the room understood what it was looking at. These were not Earth's records. These were theirs. Sirvos moved first, a single sharp step forward from where he stood, his iridescent skin shifting fast to a deep, cold blue. "What is this?" he said, and his voice had lost its smooth, ceremonial tone completely. It was the voice of someone who had just felt the ground move under their feet. This is 3 days of your communication traffic," Caden said pleasantly. "The Vethkai diplomatic channel, the one your intelligence office was running on the 43rd frequency band, which your technical team thought was clean. It was not clean. We have been reading it since approximately 4 hours after we docked." He tapped the datapad again. A new layer appeared in the projection, the Vethkai's full pre-vote strategy, laid out in their own words from their own communications. The fabricated data sets they had prepared for the pre-sovereign motion, the list of delegations they had identified as persuadable, and the specific leverage points flagged for each one. A communication between Sirvos and a Vethkai intelligence coordinator dated 6 weeks earlier confirming that the motion had been planned before the conclave had even opened, and then the piece that made the room go very, very quiet. A communication between Sirvos and the head of the Lurian merchant delegation. Not a diplomatic communication, a private one, sent on a frequency that neither party had believed anyone else could access. In it, the Lurian delegate confirmed that 3 neutral species votes had been secured through what the document carefully called pre-negotiated trade incentives, which was a long and formal way of saying that 3 delegations had been paid to vote for the motion that would strip Earth of its standing. The Lurian head delegate did not move. He sat at his table with his hands flat on the surface and his face completely still. The expression of a man who had just watched a door that was supposed to be locked swing wide open. Essal looked at the projection, then at her senior delegate, then back at the projection. She felt something break clean apart inside her chest. Not surprise exactly, because she had spent 3 years learning that the galaxy's most elegant people were often its least honest ones. But something else. Something that felt like the last version of a story she had told herself about how the world worked, collapsing quietly into dust. "This is a fabrication," Sirvos said. His voice had recovered some of its steadiness. "These records are manufactured. The human delegation has produced false evidence to—" "I expected you to say that," Caden said. He tapped the pad a 3rd time. The second file was different from the first. The first file had been about what happened at this conclave, and the second file was about everything else. It opened with a star map, a large one, showing a wide swath of known space. Pinned to specific points on the map were markers in Earth's deep space monitoring network, a network that every alien intelligence assessment had classified as a basic weather and debris tracking system. The kind of thing a young civilization built in its early spaceflight years and never really upgraded. Except it had been upgraded. Quietly, that over the course of 30 years, the original weather network had been expanded and deepened into something that had no official name in any public document because it had never been officially announced. It covered more of known space than any other passive intelligence system operated by any civilization at this table. It had been listening since before half the species in this room had known Earth existed, and it had heard a great deal. And the file that opened was not a complete record. It was a summary. But the summary was enough. There were highlights from HFY war planning sessions conducted 7 years ago in what they had assumed was complete secrecy. There were Dreth Collective internal consensus records from 4 years back that revealed the full scope of their expansion plans in the outer corridor. There were Lurian financial routing documents that connected 3 separate interstellar banking entities to a single investment structure that had been quietly buying resource rights on worlds that belonged to smaller civilizations, worlds whose populations did not know their resource rights were being sold. The chamber had been loud with reaction until that second file opened. Then it became so quiet that the hum of the station's environmental systems was audible. "Well, how long?" said a voice from the far end of the table. It was the representative of the Mavari Collective, a small species, usually cautious and calm, who had voted for the motion 11 minutes ago. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have you been listening?" "Long enough," Caden said. He let that sit for a moment, then he moved to the third and final file. The military file was not long. It did not need to be. It opened with a single image, a spatial array photograph showing a cluster of objects in a star system 3 light years from Earth's nearest colony. The objects were ships, not the small, patchy, embarrassing kind of ships that the human delegation had arrived on. These were different, dark, angular, built in a way that suggested every curve and surface had been designed with a specific and deliberate purpose. They were not large. They were not flashy. They did not hum with psionic energy or shimmer with light. They were numerous. And attached to each ship in the image was a small data tag listing the specific weapon systems on board and, more importantly, the specific armor and shielding signatures each system had been designed and tested against. Every signature in the list belonged to a species currently seated at this table. Servos stared at the image for a long time. His skin had stopped shifting colors. It had settled into a flat, pale tone that Caden had learned was the HFY equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Caden stepped back from the podium. "I am not here to start a war," he said, and his voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the chamber. "Earth does not want a war. We want a seat at this table, the same seat every other species here has, with the same rights and the same vote. That is all we came here for." He looked directly at Servos. But I want to be very precise about something right now, so that there is no confusion later. You have 72 hours to withdraw this motion. Recall the HFY forward fleet currently positioned in the Kepler corridor. Yes, we know about that too. And return formal administration of the 3 mining colonies your survey ships quietly annexed in the outer Dravari system 2 years ago to their original inhabitants. After 72 hours, this stops being a diplomatic matter. The silence held. Servos opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The presiding officer looked around the chamber with the expression of someone who had been running formal votes at the conclave for 20 years and had never once needed to handle a situation that did not have a procedure. The vote," he managed. "The motion currently before the chamber." "Call it," said the Mavari representative quietly. It was called. The 8 votes had been committed to the motion 11 minutes ago. Not one of those 8 votes held. The motion failed, 0 in favor, with every delegation either voting against or abstaining in the kind of fast, urgent silence that meant every delegate in the room was already thinking about the fastest way to get a message home. Caden picked up his cracked datapad from the podium. He walked back to the human seat at the far end of the arc. He sat down. He folded his hands. And he waited for whatever came next, the same way he had been waiting since the moment the ship with the patchy hull and the grinding landing gear had first touched down in Ireth Station's bay. Calmly, completely, and without any doubt at all about how this was going to end. The next 72 hours were the loudest the station had been in a generation. Not loud with celebration or ceremony or the usual noise of a functioning conclave. Loud with the sound of delegations talking very fast behind closed doors. Loud with the sound of encrypted transmissions going home to governments that had been very confident about how this summit would go and were now revising every plan they had made based on that confidence. Loud with the sound of a story that everyone thought they understood turning completely inside out. The Vethkai delegation went into formal seclusion 3 hours after the vote failed. Taisirvos did not appear at the evening's social gathering. He did not appear at the next morning's session either. One of his junior officers presented a brief statement saying that the Vethkai delegation was reviewing its position and would issue a formal response in due course. The junior officer read the statement with the expression of someone who had drawn the shortest possible straw and was very unhappy about it. The Lurian head delegate did appear at the morning session, and he sat at the table with perfect composure and said nothing for 4 hours and then requested a private meeting with Caden, which Caden agreed to with the same polite calm he had used for everything else. What was said in that meeting was not recorded. Not by Lurian technology, not by the station's own systems, and certainly not by anyone in the room. But when it ended, the Lurian delegate emerged with slightly less color in his face than he had walked in with, and the Lurian Consortium's formal position on Earth's conclave membership shifted from neutral to supportive before the day was out. The Dreth Collective remained silent. This was not unusual for the Dreth Collective. They were silent about most things. But Caden's team noted that the hive mind's communication pulses, which Pry had been tracking on her passive array since day 1, had increased in frequency by a factor of 6 since the vote, which meant that inside whatever passed for the collective's internal conversation, a great deal was being processed and revised. By the end of the first day after the vote, now 2 of the Vethkai's client species had formally requested reclassification of their relationship with the Vethkai Empire from allied to independent partner, which was a diplomatic way of creating distance very quickly without making it look like panic. By the end of the second day, a 3rd had done the same. The Vethkai formal response came in the 71st hour. It was presented quietly and without ceremony by the same junior officer who had read the first statement. The motion was formally withdrawn. The forward fleet in the Kepler corridor was being recalled for scheduled maintenance, and a process was being initiated to review the administrative situation in the outer Drevari system in the interest of, as the statement put it, ensuring clarity of governance and the rights of established populations. It was the most carefully worded surrender Caden had ever read. He accepted it without comment. The conclave reconvened for its final session 2 days later. Earth was formally granted full member status by a vote that was not close. The species that had been paid to support the original motion either voted in favor or abstained, which in the current climate amounted to the same thing. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of this particular record. After the session ended, when the chamber was emptying and delegates were gathering their materials and beginning the long process of returning to their ships, Essel found Caden on the observation deck. He was standing at the wide curved window, looking out at the stars with a cup of something warm in his hand, one of the supplies his team had brought from the ship. The armor was still on. The cracked datapad was in his other hand, held loosely at his side. She had thought about what she wanted to say for 2 days. In the end, she just asked what she actually wanted to know. "Why did you not show them from the start?" she said. "The intelligence network, the ships, all of it. You could have walked into this station and put everything on the table on day 1 and none of this would have happened. Why did you wait?" Caden looked at the stars for a moment before he answered. "Because of what they showed me while I was waiting," he said. "The ones who mock you, really mock you, openly and without caution. They are telling you something important. They are showing you exactly how far they are willing to go, exactly what they think the consequences will be, and exactly how little they believe you are capable of." He turned to look at her, Servos would not have moved that motion if he had respected us at the start. The Lurian Consortium would not have taken money to deliver votes if they had thought we were watching. The whole operation, all of it, everything they planned together before this summit even started, only worked if we were exactly what they thought we were. He lifted the cracked datapad slightly. The gear was bait. Their arrogance was the trap. We needed them to walk all the way in before we could close it. Essel was quiet for a moment. She looked at the datapad, the diagonal crack running across its face, the screen that still worked perfectly beneath it. Was anything about it actually broken? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. The calm stayed, but something warmer moved through it, something that had been patient for a long time and was finally allowing itself to exist. "The screen," he said. She laughed, a short surprise sound that she had not expected to make. It felt strange after the weight of the past few days. It felt oddly like something beginning rather than something ending. She looked back out at the stars. "So your people have been out here longer than anyone knew," she said. "We have been listening longer than anyone knew," Caden said. "That is not the same thing as being present. We are present now." He paused. "We intend to stay." 20 years passed. Urath Station was rebuilt, not physically, but in every way that mattered. The old Conclave Charter was replaced by a new one, built on 3 pillars that had been drafted by Earth's legal team in the months after the summit, and then negotiated, amended, and finally accepted by every member species over the course of 3 years of careful work. The pillars were transparency of intelligence, neutral arbitration of disputes, and open verification of member claims. The first pillar had been Caden's idea. His reasoning had been simple. If everyone knew that no communication on the station could be kept private, and everyone would stop saying things in private that they would not say in public, it had not made the conclave comfortable. It had made it honest, which was a different thing entirely and in the long run more valuable. Caden Voss served as the first Secretary General of the restructured conclave for 9 years and then stepped down and went home to Earth, where he lived in a house near the coast and kept a cracked datapad on his desk that had not been turned on in years. And he kept it because it reminded him of something important. Not about the mission, not about the conclave, about patience, the long, difficult, underestimated kind, the kind that looked from the outside like weakness and felt from the inside like the steadiest thing in the world. The house was quiet and the view was good, and he did not miss the station. Not much. In the 20th year after the vote that had changed everything, a HFY diplomat arrived at Urath Station for his first formal session at the conclave. He was young, the grandchild of Admiral Servos, who had lived long enough to see the empire he had served fracture and rebuild itself around different values, and who had reportedly spent the last decade of his life studying what had gone wrong at the summit and telling everyone who would listen exactly what it was. The young diplomat arrived in a standard transport vessel with no extra markings, and he wore plain robes with no crest and no rank insignia. He carried a simple datapad, nothing expensive, nothing that broadcast its own importance into the surrounding air. When he was asked by a station journalist why the heir to one of the Vethkai's most prominent families had chosen to arrive with so little display, he considered the question carefully. Then he said, "Because I read the history." He understood what the lesson was. He intended to act accordingly. And then somewhere far away, on a coast on a small and once overlooked world, an old man with a cracked datapad on his desk looked out at the water and said nothing at all, which, as anyone who had known him would confirm, was exactly how he had always been most effective.